Welcome to the Revere Veterans Community in conjunction with the Revere Veterans Service and the Revere Allied Veterans Council. Today we have a special guest who will be speaking on the burial ground at Rumney Marsh. He's a 5-year veteran on the committee of Rumney Marsh. He's also a member of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts and also at the Peabody and Lunfield YMCA. And most of all, he's a history teacher of 36 years at the Revere School. So, Jeff Pearlman, thank you for coming, and I got a bunch of questions I would like to ask you.
That's fine, Morris. First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning.
Okay, before I ask you the questions, would you be kind enough to give us a little history on the Rumney Marsh burial ground?
Absolutely. Rumney Marsh burial ground was not always our local cemetery. The land was given over in 1748 by one Joshua Cheever, whose father was Thomas Cheever, a pastor here in Revere many years before. The first cemetery was actually tombs at the wall where the old church used to be on Beach Street, which is today, I believe, a counseling center across from the funeral home. Well, in 1693, the first of several bodies were taken from those tombs and interred in the new cemetery later on. 1693 then was when Mary Smith passed away. Her remains were taken in the 18th century and brought and buried in the Rumney Marsh Cemetery on Butler Street. Since then, other people who have died in our community, especially veterans, are interred in the Rumney Marsh Cemetery, the Rumney Marsh burial ground. It's one of the best kept secrets in the city. It's a treasure. It's a place where not only are veterans, beginning with the Indian and wars and the Revolutionary Wars, buried, but also Civil War veterans are there. And in fact, the last person buried there was in the 1930s, and he was a veteran of World War I. But also buried there is the son of former Governor John Winthrop, Dean Winthrop. His stone is there. Also, there is a memorial to a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, a Navy officer whose remains are at Woodlawn, but there's a plaque there for him. And most importantly, there are unmarked graves. First, there's an unmarked grave for a Revolutionary War soldier by the name of Job Warrow. Why an unmarked grave? Because he was a man of color. And on the stone is listed, along with all the other names of some of the veterans who were killed in our early wars, the name of Job Warrow. And sadly, next to his name is the word colored. Also buried along the north wall, and this is something that I really want to talk about today, are 13 slaves, yes, slaves, who in the 18th century were property of some of our citizens here in what was called Chelsea. These 13 individuals are buried at the Rumney Marsh burial ground. And on April 13th, we are going to have a ceremony, which I'll talk about later, in which we are going to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And we are in the process now of having erected a couple of informational tablets along the north wall. And on those tablets will be listed the names of the slaves, their owners, and the dates in which they passed. I think it is altogether fitting and proper that we do something of this magnitude, especially as the Emancipation Proclamation anniversary comes about. The Rumney Marsh burial ground is an institution that we on the Restoration Committee have had several fundraisers in order to raise money and improve. We've had lobster bakes, we've had times in which we've served Chinese food, we've also had the bocce on the beach tournament the last 3 years, which has been very popular. And the money that's been raised has gone into several different things that we've done. One is to restore a monument on the grounds at the cemetery, which gives a pretty short history of the Rumney Marsh Cemetery. Also, we've taken the money and we've used it for brickwork. We've used it for landscaping. We're going to put a bench there, a sitting bench, which is going to be dedicated to Peter McCauley, my mentor, a Revere historian for many years, and a small garden, which will be dedicated to Ann Fideli, who was on our committee and who passed away tragically about a year ago. So that pretty much, Morris, is a little bit of the history of the Rumney Marsh Cemetery. Again, it's a history in which we don't want to see forgotten. It's a history in which we continue to have affairs there and ceremonies there. I give tours at the Rumney Marsh Cemetery, both for adults and for school children, and I invite anybody to get in touch with me. I have a key to the cemetery in my pocket as I speak, and I'll be very happy to go through that cemetery and discuss with students and adults where the certain graves are, for example, Dean Winthrop, the Civil War era veterans, and of course where the slaves are interred.
Can I ask you, Jeff, can you tell me who the oldest, tell us out there, who the oldest person that is buried in the cemetery?
Right, as I mentioned before, Mary Smith, along with her husband John, are the oldest people buried at the cemetery. Now, again, Mary Smith died in 1693. She was buried in the tomb where the old church was, where today is the counseling center on Beach Street. And then after Cheever gave the land over to the town of Chelsea, which was called then, the remains of Mary Smith were taken from the tomb along with all the others who had been buried there and reinterred in the cemetery. And I know exactly where her stone is, and one of the places that I take both adults and children is to Mary Smith's grave, and it says right on there the year that she passed. The pin that I'm wearing right now, okay, on my lapel, actually says the Rumney Marsh Burial Ground and the date 1693.
Wow. So you're talking about 320.
I would say it's one of the oldest. It's one of the oldest cemeteries in Suffolk County.
Okay, another question came to me. Why should we learn about Revere's history and culture, strictly about Revere's history and culture?
I think Revere's history and culture is tied into our state's history, and it's also tied into our country's history. And there are many other historic places in Revere that we've probably driven by or walked by several times, and we have no idea about it. Besides the cemetery, there's Slade's Mill. Slade's Mill on Chelsea Creek was actually built by Thomas Pratt in the early 18th century. And it was bought up by Henry Slade and his two sons, David and Levi. And throughout the 19th and even into the 20th century, it was a spice mill. And the good people of Chelsea would go there and get their spices, their cinnamon and their ginger and their pepper, which came from the islands, and they would grind them up at Slade's Mill, and that was a major source of seasonings for people. Today, Slade's Mill is a rooming house at the top, but at the bottom, it's still a museum. And they actually still have machines that grinded the spices, and also some of the great pictures that were taken at the time too, showing some of the islands like Sumatra, where some of the spices came from. If you go to City Hall and you go upstairs near the council chamber, you'll see two pictures up on the wall of Paul Revere. And you might say, oh, there are plenty of pictures and busts of Paul Revere. But the one that really gets my attention, and I think it's one of the only pictures ever, is showing Paul Revere as he was captured before he finished his famous ride on April 18th, 1775, to warn the good people that the regulars were coming, the British were coming. And he actually was captured and never completed his ride, and many people don't know that fact, but we actually have a painting of that capture at City Hall. Another building of historic nature in which I take students and adults to is our own public library. And what's interesting about our own public library is if you stand in front of the library and you look on top of the door, you'll see it says, Gift of Andrew Carnegie, and in Roman numerals, 1902. And there are many people who have no idea that Andrew Carnegie, even though he was a steel tycoon and a very, very wealthy man, gave much of his money to cities and towns to build libraries and concert halls. And the Revere Women's Club in 1901, 1902 wanted to build a library here in the town of Revere, as it was called then. And so they contacted Andrew Carnegie in Scotland. And indeed, he donated money which was matched by the Revere Journal, and that's how our library became built.
By the way, Jeff, I got to tell you, you mentioned Andrew Carnegie.
Mm-hmm.
I worked for an engineering company, and there was a company called Carnegie Steel. And
Yes.
I think he was the founder of
He was
that.
the founder, that's right.
Down in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
That's exactly right.
Right.
So you got Slade's Mill, you've got the library, you've got the burial ground. There's also a couple of houses in Revere that are very, very old. Unfortunately, they are now a particular business. For example, on Broadway, in fact, I drove by it this morning, on Broadway there's the Lewis and Clark Realty Company. And on that site was one of the oldest houses in Revere. And also on School Street, there was a bar and a saloon, and it was later owned by a family, and that goes back as well to the late 17th and early 18th century. So there were many, many buildings, and there's so much culture in the city that we citizens, I don't want to say are ignorant of, but we just haven't really been aware of it, to tell you the truth. And I've tried to do my part to give citizens at least a little bit of knowledge of what we have in our own backyard. I call it history in our own backyard.
I got to tell you, Jeff, I've lived in Revere over 60 years. I only found out about Rumney Marsh a few years ago. I never knew it existed. Could you please tell the people where it's located and how to get there from different directions?
Well, Rumney Marsh is simply the old name of Revere. Rumney Marsh was a part of Boston. And if we could go back in history, I could tell you the dates from approximately 1624 to 1739. We were called Rumney Marsh, actually a section of Boston. And then in 1739, Chelsea became our name. Okay? Not only was Chelsea called Chelsea, but Revere was called Chelsea and Winthrop was called Chelsea. It was the entire area of Chelsea, Revere, and Winthrop was called Chelsea. And we were Chelsea from 1739 to 1846. And in 1846, we decided to break away. And we formed the town of North Chelsea. And from 1846 to 1871, that was the name of our town, North Chelsea. And when I teach the kids about the Civil War, and I ask them to go back and do some research, who were the people of our community that fought and died in the Civil War, don't go looking under Revere. Don't go looking under Chelsea. You've got to look under North Chelsea, because that's what we were known as between 1846 and 1871. In 1871, we became the town of Revere, named after, of course, the patriot Paul Revere. And in 1915, we became the city of Revere. We elected our first mayor, and we've been the city of Revere ever since.
Right. Being a history teacher for 36 years, could you tell us what kind of curriculum you did for the Revere schools? Well,
it goes back to 1976, actually, during our bicentennial year. In 1976, I was hearing so much about the celebrations for our 200th anniversary as a nation, and I went to the Revere Journal, and I approached a couple of people there, and I asked them if I could write a column for the Revere Journal. I didn't want any money, but I would begin by talking about the Native Americans who inhabited Rumney Marsh in the 17th century and go all the way through and talk about Revere Beach. And each week I wrote a column for the Journal back then, and what I did was I collected, of course, all those articles. Well, I was teaching at the Lincoln School in the 1980s and early 1990s when computers became in vogue. And Dr. Malfitano, who was the principal of the Lincoln School, wanted to make computers instead of an elective. He wanted to make computers mandatory for the kids, and he needed an elective so the kids could choose. And I raised my hand and I said, I think I could devise a 16-week curriculum on the local history of Revere. And I did it. I did it based on the articles that I wrote for the Revere Journal. And I've been very fortunate not only to have been teaching that myself and giving field trips to the kids, but it's still being taught today in the various schools in Revere. And I also every May, I'm invited to go to the Wayland School and talk to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders about the history of Revere. I have a slideshow presentation that I give as well, based on a coloring book that the 3rd graders use, and the coloring book has pictures of Slade's Mill, the burial ground, Paul Revere, and I talk to the kids about Revere Beach and the roller coaster, the cyclone, of course, and they're fascinated.
About a week ago, the senior center, 6 of us went to the I.C. Wayland School, and we had to talk to the kids in the 4th grade, 5th grade, and we explained to them about the Second World War, but we never gave them a lesson on the history of Rumney Marsh.
What was their reaction?
Excellent.
Yeah.
They loved it.
Yeah.
By the way, I know there's a committee on the Rumney Marsh. Could you mention the people that are on their committee and what their functions are?
Absolutely. We have a committee for the restoration of the Rumney Marsh burial ground. The committee has been in existence for over 4.5 years. There are some incredible, hard-working people on that committee, led by Nick Boer. But also on that committee is City Councilor Ira Novoselsky, Annette Bornstein, librarian Lona Frangillo, Bob Upton, Lenny Piazza, and Nick Catanazzo. Also on that committee, and sadly she passed away last year, was Ann Fideli. All of these, and myself of course, all of us work very, very hard. Each of these individuals is dedicated not just in making the Rumney Marsh burial ground a place that we in Revere can be proud of, but improving the image of our city and enhancing all of our monuments and our historical buildings.
Okay, another question I would like to ask you. What is the committee doing to organize to raise funds? And when they do raise the funds, where to mail the funds or to mail the donations?
Okay. Over the past several years, we've had lobster bakes. We've had times in which we've had Chinese food coming in. We've also made a video, by the way, and the video is about Rumney Marsh burial ground. It's for sale. Probably at 108 Beach Street is where you could purchase it. It's a wonderful video showing the entire history of the Rumney Marsh burial ground. We also, the last 3 years, have what's called Bocce on the Beach, in which we have several teams come in, and we have a professional bocce organization come down. They mark out the area on the sand, and for 3 or 4 hours, bocce on the beach goes on. It's right across the street from the MDC station, the State Police Barracks. And that's been a tremendous fundraiser for us. You asked, Morris, what we do with the funds. As I mentioned earlier, it all goes for the improvement of the cemetery. If you go down to Butler Street today, you'll see that beautiful monument with a little bit of the history of the cemetery that I recounted to you a few minutes ago. You'll also see some of the landscaping improvements we've made. You'll also see some of the brickwork that's about to be done. Hopefully on April 13th, we'll have a nice little ceremony there and unveil the 2 informational tablets depicting the 13 slaves that were buried along the north wall in unmarked graves.
Jeff, I'd like to say one thing about last year sometime. I went down to the Historical Society. They had a flea market sale. Mm-hmm. I bought some of the nice things at the flea market. Could you tell the people what they can donate to the Historical Society, what type of things, they would like over there, and the money raised to help fund for Rumney Marsh?
Any kind of pictures, any kind of textiles, anything of historical nature, they would love to have at 108 Beach Street. The officers over there are doing a wonderful job. They're working, as a matter of fact, with us for this event coming up on April 13th. And I have nothing but praise for them and what they did. If you've never been to 108 Beach Street, I believe they're open on Saturday mornings, please go in and walk around and see the memorabilia that's there from the 18th century right down to today. There's a Peter Macaulay room, which is dedicated just to Revere Beach, and I think everybody is familiar with Peter and the wonderful work that he did. over the years. Norman Gautreau's paintings are there. There's a room for Horatio Alger, who was born in Revere and, of course, was one of America's greatest writers in the 19th century. His Rags to Riches books are all there as well. Maps of old Revere are there. So if you have anything that you think you can add to our history and our culture, I'm sure the people at the Revere Society for Cultural and Historic Preservation, RSCHP, would be very, very happy to receive it.
Right.
And they also sell, by the way, they also sell on the beach and at 108 Beach Street many tapes and many audio tracks, as well as other items which you can purchase to learn about our history and our culture, which of course is what we're all about here in not only the Committee to Restore the Rumney Marsh Burial Ground, but also the Revere Society for Cultural and Historical Preservation. I don't know any other town that has two hard-working committees like we have in Revere to try to educate the community of our history and our culture.
Very good, Jeff. Now I got to ask you, why is it very vital that the young people in the schools in the city of Revere do learn about their community?
Well, Morris, unfortunately, we're not in our 20s anymore, and we're not going to be around forever. And unfortunately, people like Norman Gautreau and Peter McCauley and Ann Fideli, they've all passed away. And without young people learning about our history from people like us, it's going to be forgotten. And what a tragedy that would be. What a tragedy to not know about the Rumney Marsh Cemetery or Slade's Mill or the history of the Revere Public Library. It's history in our own backyard. It's places that we go by every single day and we don't even blink twice. It is important that this is being taught in our schools. It is important that young people visit these historic places in Revere, are given tours of the historic places in Revere so that they will grow up and spread the word. We also have a changing demographic, as we all know, in Revere as well. And many people are moving out, many new people are moving in. Good people are moving into Revere, with a lot of children, and the schools in Revere are blossoming. These are the people that we should target. These are the people who should learn about our city. Even if they've only been here for a short time, or even if they don't plan to spend a lifetime, they should learn about history in their own backyard. Every single city and town in Massachusetts has a local history. I teach part-time at Salem State University, and one of the courses I teach is the geography of New England. And the first project I give my students is a project in which they have to do research on their own city and town in Massachusetts, and they have to make an oral presentation of that research. That's how much I believe our local history is important. And so, you know, in short, it's the young people today. They have to know about our history so they can keep it alive.
That's good, because, you know, if I had known about this before we went to the Whalen School, we would have done a presentation on the local history of the city of Revere. I'd like to change the subject, if I may, for a few minutes. We have a lot of things going on in the city of Revere. And, for example, on April the 12th, at 12 o'clock, I believe.
April 13th.
April 13th.
Saturday.
Saturday, April 13th. Rumney Marsh will be holding their thing for the 13 slaves.
Right.
So all you people out there are welcome to come. We'd like to see a good crowd. We had a good crowd last year. I'd like to see another good crowd this year.
Let me mention a little bit about that, if I may.
Please do.
Thank you. On April 13th, again, at noon, we're going to have a ceremony to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And there aren't many citizens who realize that there are, indeed, more than a dozen slaves interred in the Rumney Marsh Cemetery along the North Wall. We have contacted both city and state officials, and hopefully they'll come down on that day and talk a little bit about the commemoration. I am honored to be the MC on that day and introduce the various speakers. There'll also be some school kids who will be involved, and thanks to Tom Mafucci, who is the music instructor over at the Rumney Marsh Academy, a percussion ensemble will come down as well and perform some of the patriotic songs of that era. So it is important that the good citizens of Revere make an effort to come and join in the festivities. It's not going to be a very long ceremony, maybe an hour at the most,
Right.
but it's something that I believe is very, very important. And of course, the unveiling of the 2 informational stands depicting the names and the dates of the 13 slaves that are indeed interred in the cemetery. That's April 13th at noon.
Are we going to have any special guests coming down there that you know of, like we had last year?
As far as I know, we've invited Congressman Markey. We've invited Representative Reinstein, Speaker of the House, Bob DeLeo, to come down. We've also invited the governor and also members of the 54th Massachusetts Reenactment Regiment, the all-black regiment, to also perform. Hopefully, if they could fit it into their schedule to be there, that would be absolutely wonderful. But rain or shine, the ceremony is still going to go on, and I think it's going to be one that the good people of Revere are not going to forget.
Good. Before we close, Jeff, I want to thank you for coming down here. If you got something to say, take a couple of minutes to wrap up, but then I just want a couple of minutes to say something about our
Absolutely.
city.
First of all, Morris, I want to thank you. I want to thank cable TV here in Revere for letting me come here this morning and talk about a subject that I absolutely love, a subject that I've been involved in most of my adult life, and that's local history. I began as a kid just wanting to know who some of the streets were named after. I mean, I grew up on Constitution Avenue in the housing development off of Coolidge Street. And that was historic to begin with, Constitution Avenue. And so I wanted to know who the streets were named after. And then from there, as I mentioned, I began to write my articles in 1976. So I'm very happy to come here and talk about that. I'm also very happy to come here and talk to you about the ceremony coming up on April 13th as well. It is my hope, it is my prayer that my words will not fall on deaf ears this morning, and that both adults and young people will pick up the baton and pass it on, and hopefully we will continue to learn about the history and the culture of our great city of Revere.
Thank you, Jeff. First of all, I want to thank you for giving me a history lesson on the city of Revere.
Anytime.
And I'm sure to the people out there are interested.
It was a pleasure, Morris.
Thank you. And before we close, I would like to say, may God bless you, Jeff. God bless the people of Revere. God bless our troops, and God bless the United States of America. And thank you for listening, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.